The millionaire's son lost his voice the day his mother died. The trauma locked him into a silence that the best doctors in the world couldn't break. The father, a man who could buy anything, couldn't buy back his son's voice. It was in this atmosphere of sadness that a simple Italian cleaning lady was hired. Then one day, the father heard a soft and familiar singing coming from the room. He ran, heart tight, and the scene he found made him break down in tears. The cleaning lady was singing the same Italian opera that the boy's deceased mother used to sing to him to sleep. And the boy, for the first time in years, was singing along. The silence in the Davenport mansion was a living thing. It crept down the marble corridors, nested in the corners of the high ceilings, and wrapped each piece of antique furniture in a cold, invisible embrace. For Arthur Davenport, a man whose name was synonymous with success and power, this silence was his greatest failure. From his office on the top floor of a skyscraper that pierced the Manhattan clouds, he commanded an empire. With a single phone call, he could move millions of dollars, sway the stock market, or acquire new businesses that would add more digits to his already vast fortune. His net worth was a number so astronomical most people couldn't even conceive of it. A mountain of assets, stocks, and investments in gold and cryptocurrency that secured him a place among the wealthiest men in the world. But when he crossed the threshold of his own home, he wasn't a billionaire, he was just a father, helpless and devastated by the silence of his only son. Leo, at just 7 years old, had not uttered a single word for exactly 1 year, since the day his mother's voice, that of the acclaimed soprano Elara, had been silenced forever. The most renowned doctors, whose fees could fund a small country, gave his condition a name: selective mutism. A wall erected by profound trauma, impenetrable to all the therapies and approaches that Arthur's immense capital could buy. The house, once a sanctuary of music and laughter, had transformed into a mausoleum of painful memories. The grand piano, which Elara used to play with contagious passion, now lay locked in the music room, a polished mahogany coffin guarding the melodies that were gone. Arthur often saw little Leo with his ear pressed against the solid wood door, a lonely sentinel trying to catch the echoes of a happier time. The governess, a Mrs. Agnes Sterling, was a woman of relentless efficiency and ironclad discipline. She believed that order and routine were the cure for all ailments, especially those of the soul. Leo's day was meticulously planned, with scheduled times for speech therapy, psychology sessions, and educational activities aimed at stimulating communication. To Agnes, the boy's silence was a disorder, a flaw in the system that needed to be corrected with persistence and method. However, her rigidity only deepened the chasm between Leo and the world, causing him to retreat further into his silent fortress. Arthur watched, his heart aching, feeling like a stranger in his own home, a spectator to a play whose script he could not rewrite. His instincts, so sharp in business and wealth accumulation, failed miserably when it came to reaching his son's wounded heart. Each day was a repetition of the last, a cycle of frustrated hope and mounting despair. It was on one of those grey afternoons, after watching Agnes try to force Leo to identify figures on colourful flashcards, receiving only a vacant stare in return, that Arthur's exhaustion reached its limit. He needed something different, anything, a breath of fresh air in that stagnant, methodical environment. It was then that he remembered the request from the staffing agency. A cleaning lady was needed, as the last one had resigned. Unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion, reviewing the list of candidates, one name jumped out at him: Isabella Rossi, an Italian immigrant with modest references, but with a note from the interviewer that intrigued him. Possesses a warm presence and a voice that sounds like music. Without a second thought, moved by an impulse that came not from the logic of his investments, but from a deep, desperate place in his father's heart, He made a decision. He didn't know it, but at that moment, the cash flow of his emotional life was about to undergo the most significant turnaround of all, one that no profitability analysis could ever predict. Isabella Rossi arrived at the Davenport mansion on a Tuesday morning, carrying a faded canvas bag and a heart full of an apprehension she skillfully disguised with a serene smile. The tall, imposing wrought-iron gate buzzed open with an electronic hum that sounded strangely hostile. Before her, a white gravel path snaked through an immaculately manicured garden, where every leaf seemed to have been individually polished. The house wasn't a house. It was a statement, a monument of stone and glass that spoke of incalculable wealth, of a power that could move the world. It was the result of years of Arthur's shrewd investments, of masterful plays on Wall Street that had transformed his already considerable estate into something approaching that of a small nation. Isabella, whose only inheritance was a collection of lullabies and the sun of her homeland in her memory, felt like a small paper boat adrift on a billionaire's ocean. She was met at the door not by a butler, but by Mrs. Agnes Sterling herself, whose rigid posture and analytical gaze made her feel immediately inspected. Agnes was the personification of order. Her hair was pulled back into a bun, so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, leaving her with an expression of perpetual disapproval. "Mrs. Rossi," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth, "I trust you understand the nature of this position. Discretion and silence are of the utmost importance. Mr. Davenport values his privacy, and young Master Leo requires a calm environment, free of unnecessary stimuli. Your duties are listed on this clipboard. Follow them to the letter." There was no welcome or gesture of courtesy, just a set of rules delivered like a court summons. Isabella nodded, her gentle smile not faltering, though she felt the weight of the house's cold atmosphere settle on her shoulders. She began her work in the grand entrance hall. The marble under her feet was so polished it reflected the vaulted ceiling like a dark lake. Every movement echoed in the vast space, a constant reminder of the silence that had been imposed upon her. But silence was not natural for Isabella. Music lived in her, flowing through her veins like blood itself. As she dusted a Ming Dynasty porcelain vase, an object that was likely worth more than everything her family had ever owned, she began to hum. It was a low sound, almost a whisper, an old Neapolitan aria about the sea and a lost love. It wasn't a performance, but a breath, a way of connecting with the world and warding off the loneliness that emanated from the walls. Upstairs, in the playroom that looked more like a therapy lab, Leo sat on the floor, pushing a wooden car back and forth with no interest. Agnes was trying to engage him with animal flashcards, her voice monotone and insistent. "Leo, look, what is this? It's a lion. Can you say lion?" The boy didn't react, his gaze lost in the pattern of the Persian rug. Then a faint sound reached his ears, the soft, melancholy melody drifting up the staircase. The movement of his hand stopped. His small head tilted slightly, an antenna tuning into a long-forgotten frequency. His eyes, usually dull, gained a flicker of curiosity. He stood up, his bare feet silent on the plush carpet, and walked to the door, peeking through the gap. Down below, he saw the new woman. She moved with a quiet grace, and from her lips came that sound that seemed to fill the empty spaces inside him. Agnes, noticing the boy's absence from her side, rose abruptly, irritation creasing her brow. "Leo, what are you doing? Come back here this instant." She marched to the door, and her gaze followed Leo's. She saw Isabella in the hall, now wiping down the staircase banister, her voice a little more audible, a lullaby that spoke of stars and boats on the sea. Agnes's face hardened, transforming into a mask of icy fury. She didn't see a melody. She saw an infraction. She didn't hear a song. She heard chaos knocking at the door of her ordered world. "Mrs. Rossi!" Her voice cut through the air like a whip, annihilating the music instantly. The silence that followed was violent, and in it, the eyes of a boy and a governess met in a mute confrontation, an invisible battlefield where a lullaby had just lit the fuse of a war, the echo of Mrs. Agnes Sterling's voice hung in the air, thick and cold as winter fog. Isabella slowly straightened up, the dust cloth still in her hand, and turned to face the governess, who was descending the stairs with firm, measured steps, like a general inspecting her troops. Little Leo watched from the top, his wide, frightened eyes darting between Agnes's rigid figure and Isabella's calm presence. "My instructions were clear, Mrs. Rossi," Agnes hissed, stopping a few feet away. "This house is to be a sanctuary of calm. Leo's treatment requires a controlled environment. Your noises are a harmful distraction." Isabella met the governess's icy glare without flinching. In her village in Italy, music was like bread. It fed the soul. The idea that a song could be harmful was as foreign to her as the sun being cold. "I apologize, Mrs. Sterling," she replied, her voice low but clear, with an accent that softened the words. "Where I come from, silence is for sad places. I meant no disturbance." The response, devoid of the submissiveness Agnes expected, only irritated her further. "This is not your village. This is a home with rules, and the main rule is silence. Understood?" She didn't wait for an answer, just cast one final warning glance before turning, grabbing Leo's hand with excessive firmness and pulling him back upstairs, away from the cleaning woman's influence. From his office, a fortress of mahogany and leather overlooking Central Park, Arthur Davenport heard the exchange, not the exact words, but Agnes's cutting tone. He was analyzing a complex report on the profitability of a new tech investment fund, trying to decide whether to allocate more capital to cryptocurrency or diversify into European real estate. These were decisions involving millions of dollars, capable of increasing or decreasing his vast estate overnight. Yet his mind wasn't on the profit charts or stock market tickers. It was on the sound of Agnes's voice, a voice that always seemed to be correcting, repressing, controlling. He wondered, not for the first time, if her approach wasn't turning the house into an even more sterile and oppressive environment for Leo. All his wealth, his assets spread across the globe, felt useless. He could buy the silence of the markets, but he couldn't buy a single word from his son. Later that day, Isabella was cleaning the glass of the French doors that led to the garden. Leo was outside on a swing, but not swinging. He just stared into space, a little prince exiled in his own kingdom. Agnes watched him from the porch, a stopwatch in her hand, likely timing his outdoor activity. Feeling the watchful eye, Isabella didn't dare sing. Instead, she began to hum very softly, a tune so faint it was barely distinguishable from the sound of the wind in the trees. It was the same lullaby she had sung earlier. The effect was immediate, though subtle. Leo's head turned slowly in her direction. He didn't smile or make a gesture, but his shoulders, usually tense and hunched, seemed to relax a fraction. For an instant, their gazes met through the glass. In that moment, an invisible bridge was built over the chasm of silence, a fragile connection woven with the notes of a forgotten melody. Agnes, focused on her stopwatch, noticed nothing. Isabella's workday was coming to an end. Her last task was to clean the long second-floor hallway, a corridor she instinctively felt was the heart of the home's sadness. And there, halfway down, was the door to the music room, double, dark, and imposing, locked. As she wiped the floor, she saw Leo approach stealthily. He didn't see her. His eyes were fixed on the door. With a hesitation that broke Isabella's heart, he pressed his ear to the cool wood, closing his eyes as if in prayer. He remained that way for a long minute, a pilgrim before a forbidden shrine. The pain and longing on his small face were so palpable that Isabella felt a lump in her throat. She knew, with a certainty that came from the soul, that whatever was locking that door was also locking that little boy's heart. Finishing her work, she stood in the now empty hallway, looking at the polished brass lock. Agnes's orders echoed in her mind, stern and unyielding. But the image of Leo's face pressed against the door was stronger. In her hand, the ring of service keys Agnes had given her glinted in the dim light of the hall, a silent promise of either rebellion or healing. In the days that followed, the Davenport mansion became a silent stage for a drama of opposing wills. On one side, Agnes Sterling, the guardian of order, who saw Isabella as a disruptive element, a sentimental anomaly in a carefully calibrated system. On the other, Isabella, who moved through the house like a warm current, bringing with her not the sound, but the feeling of music. She obeyed the rule of silence, but her inner humming seemed to permeate the very air, making it less heavy, less oppressive. She found small ways to circumvent Agnes's rigidity. While arranging Leo's bedsheets, she folded them to the rhythm of a silent tarantella. As she polished the silverware, her fingers danced over the forks and spoons in a muted waltz. They were tiny, invisible acts of rebellion, small seeds of life planted in the sterile soil of discipline. Leo, for his part, became Isabella's secret observer. He followed her with his eyes wherever she went. He noticed how she paused to admire a sunbeam streaming through a window, how she smiled at her own reflection in the polished marble. For a boy who lived in a world of serious faces and corrective voices, Isabella's quiet joy was a fascinating mystery. His obsession with the music room door intensified. Every day, at the same time, when Agnes was busy with her daily call to one of Leo's many therapists, he would slip into the hallway. He would press his ear against the wood, his breath held, in a desperate search for any trace of the past, any ghost-like echo of his mother's hands on the ivory keys. Isabella watched this daily ritual from a distance, her heart tight with compassion. She saw the boy, but she also saw the door. It was more than wood and metal. It was a vault, and the combination to open it wasn't on the keyring she carried, but somewhere deep in the family's memory and pain. Arthur Davenport, entrenched in his world of high-stakes deals and managing a fortune that grew by the second, felt the subtle ripples of Isabella's presence in the house. He noticed how Agnes seemed more tense, her reports on Leo's progress, or lack thereof, increasingly tinged with a poorly disguised irritation. One evening, returning home later than usual, he found a note from Agnes on his desk. "Mr. Davenport, I feel it is my duty to inform you that the new maid, despite my explicit instructions, continues to be a disruptive influence on Leo. He seems more distracted, less focused on his therapies. I advise a re-evaluation of her employment." Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. Distracted or curious? Agnes's approach was suffocating. He knew that. All his success, his ability to analyze markets and predict investment trends, seemed to abandon him when it came to navigating the delicate emotional ecosystem of his own son. He crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. For now, the Italian cleaning lady would stay. It was a gamble, a low-risk investment with an unknown potential for return, but his gut told him to wait. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday. The rain beat against the windows, wrapping the mansion in a monotonous, melancholy sound. Agnes had gone out for a doctor's appointment, leaving Leo in Isabella's care for an hour with a list of prohibitions longer than a grocery list. No television, no sweets, no noise. He is to remain in the playroom and finish his logic puzzles. As soon as Agnes's car disappeared down the gravel path, Isabella looked at Leo, who was sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by expensive educational toys that brought him no joy. She smiled at him, a genuine conspiratorial smile. She walked over to the sound system, a high-end device that probably cost more than her annual rent, and hesitated. Then she made a decision. She didn't play music. Instead, she found a CD of nature sounds. The soft sound of rain in a forest filled the room, blending with the real rain outside. She sat on the floor, not too close to Leo, and began to tap a gentle rhythm on her own legs. Tum-tum-ta, tum-tum-ta, a simple rhythm, the beat of a heart. Leo watched her, his eyes fixed on her movements. Isabella said nothing, did not invite him to join. She just continued her soft rhythm, her face serene. Slowly, like a flower blooming in slow motion, Leo's small index finger began to tap on the wooden car in front of him. Tum, tum, ta, hesitant, out of sync, but it was there. An echo, a response. Isabella's heart leaped. She didn't look at him, afraid of breaking the spell. She just kept on, and he continued to follow, his rhythm becoming a little surer, a little more aligned with hers. In that room, as the rain washed the world outside, two souls communicated in the oldest of languages, the language of rhythm. And in the hallway upstairs, the music room door seemed a little less imposing, as if its lock had finally begun to yield to the rust of loneliness. The small victory in the playroom altered the dynamic of the house in a way that only its three silent inhabitants could perceive. Agnes Sterling, upon her return, sensed a change in the air, a subtle vibration she couldn't identify, but that deeply unsettled her. The environment wasn't disordered, the rules hadn't been visibly broken, but the stillness felt different. It was less the stillness of a vacuum and more that of a held breath, of a shared secret. She watched Leo more closely in the following days, searching for cracks in his impassive facade. She found them in his eyes. His gaze was no longer invariably directed at the floor or some vague point on the wall. Sometimes she would catch him following Isabella's movements as she cleaned, a spark of interest that terrified her. To Agnes, any emotion not generated by one of her approved therapies was a contamination, an unpredictable variable that threatened her equation of control. Her response was to tighten her grip. She forbade Isabella from cleaning the upstairs rooms while Leo was present, confining her influence to the ground floor. The reports she sent to Arthur became more urgent, filled with psychological jargon about behavioral regression and improper fixation. Arthur read them in his oasis of glass and steel, while on his computer screen, stock market figures fluctuated, altering his net worth by millions of dollars with each passing minute. He saw the dividends from his stocks accumulate, the profits grow, but he felt he was operating at a devastating emotional loss. Agnes's words were clinical and alarming, but what his father's instinct told him was different. One afternoon, upon arriving home, he saw his son in the garden through the library window. Leo was watching Isabella, who was pruning some rose bushes. There was no sound, no direct interaction, but Arthur saw Leo raise his hand and drum his fingers on the window pane in a slow, deliberate rhythm. On the other side, without turning around, Isabella seemed to slow her movements with the pruning shears for an instant, in the same rhythm. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, but for Arthur, it was more revealing than all of Agnes's reports combined. Isabella felt the pressure of the governess's surveillance like a physical weight. She worked with quiet efficiency, her head down, but her heart was a whirlwind of plans and hopes. The image of Leo with his ear pressed to the music room door wouldn't leave her mind. That door was a dam, and she knew the boy's healing lay on the other side, in the pent-up waters of memory and music. The decision formed in her mind, not as a calculated plan, but as an unavoidable necessity, a truth that could no longer be ignored. She needed to create an opportunity, a crack in Agnes's fortress of rules through which the light could enter. The opportunity came the following Friday. Arthur was at a conference in Chicago, discussing a major investment that could reshape the future of his business. Agnes was locked in the ground floor office on a video call with a neurologist from Geneva, her voice a monotonous, authoritative drone that drifted up the staircase. Isabella was waxing the second-floor hallway floor. Her heart was racing. It was now or never. With her bucket and cloths beside her, she approached the music room door. She took the ring of service keys from her apron pocket, her hands trembling slightly. She selected the brass key she knew was the right one. She glanced down both ends of the hall. Empty. The drone of Agnes's voice continued from downstairs. In a movement that seemed to last an eternity, she inserted the key into the lock. She didn't turn it all the way, just enough to retract the latch. She pulled the key out and nudged the door with her hip, as if accidentally bumping into it while working. The door didn't open, but it shifted a millimeter, producing an almost inaudible click. The latch was no longer secure. She stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs, and continued waxing the floor, moving slowly away from the door. Minutes later, Leo's bedroom door opened noiselessly. He stepped into the hall, on his way to his daily pilgrimage. He was preparing to press his ear against the wood, as he always did, when he stopped. Something was different. A thin line, a dark shadow where there had never been one before. The door was ajar. Time seemed to freeze in the hallway. For Leo, the crack in the music room door was not an invitation. It was an abyss. On one side, the safe, predictable world of Agnes, a world of rules and silence. On the other, a universe of memories so powerful he feared they might consume him. His child's heart pounded, a war drum beating between fear and longing. The scent wafting from that small opening was what decided him. It was a faint, almost ghostly fragrance of lemon and lavender, the same polish his mother used on her beloved piano. It was the smell of happiness. With a shaky breath that turned into a silent sob, he pushed the door. The room was bathed in a soft gloom, cut by a single beam of light filtering through a gap in the heavy velvet curtains. The light fell directly on the grand piano's keyboard, making the ivory keys gleam like an enigmatic smile in the darkness. The air was still, thick with memories. On the music stand, a book was open to a simple melody, Ilara's elegant handwriting still visible. Leo approached the piano as one would a sleeping animal. He didn't dare make a sound. He circled the enormous instrument, running his fingertips over the polished wood, feeling the vibration of 1,000 songs that still lived within it. He remembered sitting under the piano while his mother played, the sound wrapping around him like a blanket, the vibrations tickling his feet. It was his hiding place, his sanctuary. He climbed onto the leather bench, which creaked softly under his weight. His legs barely reached the floor. He looked at the keys. His mother's hands, long and graceful, had seemed to dance upon them. His own hands, small and hesitant, hovered over the keyboard. He didn't think, he just felt. He closed his eyes and, with his index finger, pressed a single key, a middle C. The note echoed in the silent room, clear, pure, and terrifyingly loud. He jumped off the bench, startled by the sound he himself had created, as if he had awoken a giant. His heart thundered in his chest. In the hallway, Isabella, pretending to clean a nearby table, heard the sound and a shiver ran through her entire body. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent prayer on her lips. In the ground floor office, Mrs. Agnes Sterling's voice stopped mid-sentence. "The treatment modalities," she frowned. What was that sound? A strange sound, a sound that didn't belong in her controlled environment. At that exact moment, the mansion's front door opened. Arthur Davenport walked in. The weariness of his trip from Chicago etched on his face. His mind was still spinning with the details of a new investment, a multi-million-dollar deal that promised an extraordinary return for his already vast financial empire. He let his leather briefcase fall to the floor with a dull thud, the sound muffled by the rug. The house greeted him with its usual silence, a silence he hated, a silence that represented all the liabilities in his personal life that his fortune couldn't cover. He was about to call for Agnes when he heard it. The second note, an E, as hesitant and fragile as the first, but unmistakable. Arthur froze, his entire body tensing. It couldn't be, it was impossible. Then a third note sounded, a G, and then, again, the C. A broken, childish melody, but it was a melody, coming from the music room. For the first time in a year, the sound of a piano broke the spell of that house, and a billionaire's heart shattered, not with grief, but with a hope so overwhelming it left him breathless. Arthur Davenport didn't run, he flew. He took the marble stairs 2 at a time, his heart thundering in his chest with a force that drowned out all rational thought. His business empire, his shares on the stock market, his assets scattered across the globe, it all dissolved into an irrelevant haze. The only thing that mattered in the universe was that sound, those hesitant notes that were, to him, more valuable than all the gold stored in Swiss bank vaults. Each step was a mixture of terror and ecstasy. The terror that the sound would stop, that it was just a hallucination born of desperation, the ecstasy of the possibility that it was real. He reached the hallway breathless, stopping before the ajar music room door, his body trembling. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, fearing what he would find or not find inside. The scene that greeted him was like a Renaissance painting bathed in sepia. Dusty light streamed through the window, illuminating the tiny figure of his son sitting at the piano. Leo's little fingers, which Arthur had only seen clenched in frustrated fists or lying limp at his sides, moved with hesitant delicacy over the keys. He was playing a simple, fragmented melody, but it was unmistakable. The lullaby Ilara had composed for him, a song Arthur had thought was buried with her, and standing beside the boy was Isabella. She wasn't playing, not speaking. Her hand hovered inches from Leo's back, not to correct him, but to offer an invisible shield of support. Her lips moved, mouthing the melody so quietly it was nearly inaudible, guiding him not with instruction, but by sharing a memory. In that instant, Arthur's fortress of control crumbled. The tears he had suppressed for a year sprung forth, hot and uncontrollable, streaming down his face. He didn't see a sick boy undergoing therapy. He saw his son. He saw a musician finding his soul again. The sacred moment was shattered by a frigid presence. Agnes Sterling appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of controlled fury. The call with the Geneva neurologist had been cut short by the sound, and her discovery was, to her, a betrayal of the highest order. What is the meaning of this? Her voice sliced through the air, each word a shard of ice. Leo flinched, his hands falling from the keyboard like startled birds. The silence returned, heavier and more accusing than ever. Isabella turned slowly, her face calm, but her eyes showing a deep sadness at the interruption. "I was cleaning the hall," Isabella began, her voice soft. "Nigh the door. It must not have been latched properly." But Agnes wasn't interested in excuses. Her gaze swept the scene. The sentimental cleaning woman, the boy outside his controlled environment, the chaos of emotion invading her domain of logic. She turned to Arthur, who was still leaning against the doorframe, tears drying on his face. "Mr. Davenport," she said, her voice trembling with restrained indignation. "This is unacceptable. A complete violation of the therapeutic protocol. Either that woman and her sentimental, dangerous methods go immediately, or I cannot, in good conscience, continue to be responsible for his recovery." The ultimatum hung in the air, clear and absolute. To Agnes, the choice was obvious. On one side, science, discipline, measured progress. On the other, an unqualified maid and a lullaby. But for Arthur, the choice had been made the moment he heard the first note. The return on his investment in Agnes Sterling had just dropped to zero. He straightened up, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and looked at the governess. His gaze was not one of anger, but of a cold, definitive clarity, the same clarity with which he decided the fate of multi-million-dollar corporations. "Agnes," he said, his voice firm and low, but carrying an irrefutable weight. "Pack your bags." Agnes Sterling's departure was as efficient and emotionless as her tenure. In less than an hour, her suitcases were by the door, and a Blacktown car was waiting for her on the gravel path. She didn't speak a single word to Isabella, only gave her a look that mixed contempt with a strange sort of warning, as if she were abandoning a ship she believed was sailing toward a sentimental disaster. For Leo, Agnes's absence was like the end of a long storm. The pressure in the air dissipated, and the house, for the first time in ages, felt big enough for him to breathe. He didn't leave his room for the rest of the day, but Arthur knew it wasn't a retreat into his old fortress of silence. It was a processing, a recalibration of his small world, which had suddenly become larger and less threatening. Arthur felt adrift. Firing Agnes had been a visceral decision, an act of paternal protection that allowed for no doubt. Now, however, in the aftermath, the enormity of the situation settled upon him. For a year, he had delegated his son's healing to specialists, methodologies, and rigid schedules. He had trusted his assets, his ability to buy the best help money could find, just as he trusted his financial analysts to manage his vast capital. Now, he was alone, or almost. Downstairs, Isabella moved quietly, continuing her tasks. But her presence was now the sole pillar of hope in that house. He watched her from his library, a simple woman who had achieved, with an accidental gesture and a hummed melody, what the world's top doctors could not. He felt an overwhelming gratitude, but also a profound uncertainty. What was he supposed to do now? That night, after Leo had fallen asleep, Arthur went down to the kitchen. He found Isabella sitting at the small service table, sipping a cup of tea, her gaze lost in the darkness of the garden. "Isabella," he said, his own voice sounding strange in the quiet of the night. She jumped to her feet, startled. "Mr. Davenport, I'm sorry. No, please, sit," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. The gesture was so unusual, so outside the natural order of that house, that they both sat in silence for a moment. "I wanted to thank you," Arthur said finally. "What happened today?" "I haven't heard the sound of that piano in a year," Isabella smiled, a small, sad smile. "It wasn't me, sir. It was the music. It was just waiting for someone to open the door." The simplicity of her answer hit Arthur with force. He, the master of complex deals and high-risk investment strategies, had forgotten the simplest solution. Instead of opening doors, he had kept them locked, afraid of the memories they held. "What did Ilara, my wife, what did she used to sing?" he asked, the question coming out in a hoarse whisper. Isabella looked down at her hands resting on the table. "She sang everything," she answered softly. She sang the grand arias from Puccini when she was happy, and the old Neapolitan songs when she was homesick, and she sang the lullaby for Leo every night. Her voice was a home. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He remembered, of course, but the memories were shrouded in a fog of pain. Hearing someone else speak of her with such warmth and accuracy made her real again, not just a photograph in a silver frame. "How do you know so much?" he asked, intrigued. Isabella hesitated, her gaze shifting to the window. "I would listen," she said simply. "When I cleaned the hallways, you couldn't help but hear a voice like your wife's. It filled the house." They talked for over an hour. Arthur learned that Isabella came from a small village near Sorrento, that her family was poor, but that their house was always full of music. The conversation flowed in a natural, unexpected way, an exchange of stories that began to fill the vacuum Agnes had left. And as they spoke, an idea began to form in Arthur's mind. It wasn't a business strategy, but a hunch, an investment in the human capital right in front of him. He didn't know the details, But he knew that his son's cure didn't lie in more therapists or specialists. It was right here in this kitchen, in the soul of a woman who understood that sometimes the best way to heal a silent heart isn't to force it to speak, but to give it a song to listen to. The next morning, the Davenport mansion awoke to a new reality. The sun seemed to enter the tall windows with less timidity, and the silence, while still present, no longer had the weight of a shroud. Arthur summoned Isabella to his office. The space, normally a command center from which he controlled his vast financial estate, felt different. The monitors displaying stock market charts were turned off. On the mahogany desk, instead of investment reports, lay a single sheet of paper and a pen. "Isabella, please sit down," he said, gesturing to the leather chair usually reserved for his partners and lawyers. She perched on the edge of the seat, her hands clasped in her lap, her usual posture of deference mixed with a new curiosity. "I was thinking all night," Arthur began, walking around the desk to lean against it, a gesture that broke the formal barrier between them. "What Leo needs isn't another therapist or a schedule. He needs what Agnes called sentimental methods. He needs music. He needs you." Isabella's heart leaped, a mix of panic and joy. "Sir, I am just a cleaning woman. I have no qualifications." "Your qualifications," Arthur interrupted, his voice gentle but firm, "are the only ones that matter. You have the key to that music room, not the metal key, but the other one, the one I couldn't find. I would like to offer you a new position, not as a cleaner, but as Leo's caregiver, to be with him, to fill the silence, like you did yesterday." The proposal hung between them, radical and unexpected. For Isabella, it was more than a job offer. It was an acknowledgement, a validation of everything she believed. "I don't know what to say, sir." "Just say you'll accept," Arthur said, the hint of a smile touching his lips for the first time in a long while. "The salary will, needless to say, be substantially different." He mentioned a figure that made Isabella's eyes widen. It was a sum that could change her family's life in Italy. A personal cash flow she had never dreamed possible. But in that moment, the money, the euros or dollars, was secondary. What mattered was the chance to help that lost little boy. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, sir, I accept." The first afternoon of the new era began in the music room. The door now remained open. Isabella forced nothing. She entered the room and simply sat on the stool next to the piano bench. She didn't play, she just waited. It took almost an hour, but finally Leo appeared at the door, his eyes wide and wary. He looked at Isabella, then at the piano. She smiled at him gently and nodded, inviting him in. He approached slowly, step by step, and climbed onto the bench, keeping a safe distance from her. They sat in silence for a long time, just breathing the memory-laden air. Then Isabella began to hum, a very simple melody, an Italian folk song about a little bird with a broken wing that learns to fly again. She didn't look at Leo. She kept her gaze on the keyboard, her voice a soft whisper. Leo listened, his body still. Then, slowly, his index finger rose and touched a single key. It wasn't a note from the song, it was just a note, a sound, a question. Isabella stopped humming and, in response, played another note higher up the keyboard. An answer. They began a game, a conversation of notes. Leo would play a key and Isabella would respond. There was no melody, no rhythm, it was just sound, a primitive dialogue, the purest form of communication. And gradually, Arthur, watching from the doorway, saw something miraculous happen. Leo's body began to relax. The tension in his shoulders disappeared. A tiny hint of a smile, the first Arthur had seen in over a year, played at the corners of his lips. They weren't doing therapy. They were making music. They were healing each other, one note at a time, in the sanctuary of a room that had ceased to be a tomb and had become, once again, a cradle of hope. The afternoons at the Davenport mansion began to follow a new rhythm, an emotional cash flow that was finally showing a profit. The music room became the beating heart of the house, its epicenter of healing. Isabella and Leo had no fixed schedule. Their time was measured in melodies, not minutes. They always began with their game of notes, a call and response that grew more complex each day, weaving patterns of sound that were theirs alone. Then, with infinite patience, Isabella began to reintroduce Ilara's lullaby. She didn't teach it like a lesson, but told it like a story. She would play a short phrase, then stop and invent a tale about the notes. You see this one? It's a twinkling star. And this one, lower. That's the boat, rocking on the dark sea. Leo absorbed it all, his eyes shining with a comprehension that went beyond words. One day, they were attempting a slightly more complex chord, a passage in the song that was particularly emotional. Leo's hand hesitated. He tried once, his fingers landing on the wrong keys, producing a dissonance that seemed to physically wound him. He tried again, and the same mistake. Frustration clouded his face. A dark storm erasing the light the music had kindled. He pulled his hands from the keyboard abruptly and crossed his arms, his chin trembling. The silence returned to the room, but this time it was an angry, thorny silence. Isabella said nothing. She didn't try to correct him or encourage him with empty words. Instead, she turned slightly on the bench and began to tap out a complex, playful rhythm on the wooden lid of the piano. A dance rhythm, joyful and infectious. Surprised, Leo looked at her. She winked at him and continued drumming, her body swaying gently. After a long moment, one of Leo's feet began to tap on the floor, almost against his will. Then one hand uncrossed itself and, timidly, began to match her rhythm on the bench. The difficult chord was forgotten, the frustration dissolved, replaced by the universal language of rhythm. Isabella taught him that music wasn't a performance that demanded perfection, but a refuge that accepted all emotions. From his office, Arthur watched this new partnership with a fascination that bordered on reverence. He spent hours looking at his terminals, watching his investments in stocks and treasury bonds fluctuate, his net worth increasing with interest and dividends. They were numbers, abstractions that guaranteed a lifestyle of luxury, but felt increasingly empty. The real asset, the highest yield investment in his life, was happening in that room. He had spent a fortune on therapies, but the cure hadn't come from a financial investment. It had come from an investment of soul, of patience, from a woman who asked for nothing in return. He felt like a spectator, a billionaire whose only function was to fund the stage where the real miracle was taking place. And with that realization came a humility he hadn't felt in years. One night, long after Leo had fallen asleep, Arthur went down to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was steeped in darkness and silence. As he passed the small sitting room adjacent to the kitchen, where Isabella sometimes sat to read before bed, he heard something. It wasn't humming or a murmur. It was a voice, pure, crystalline, and laden with a grief so profound and beautiful it made him stop, his heart skipping a beat. Hidden in the shadow of the hallway, he peeked in. Isabella stood with her back to him, looking out the window at the full moon, and she was singing, in Italian, an aria he vaguely recognized, an operatic piece of overwhelming complexity. Her voice filled the space, controlled yet immensely powerful, a voice that did not belong to a simple cleaner or a caregiver. It was the voice of an artist, of someone who had known the great stages of the world. Arthur stood there, paralyzed, his breath caught in his throat, as the truth hit him with the force of a revelation. Who really was this woman he had let into his house and into his son's heart? The discovery of Isabella's voice transformed her, in Arthur's eyes, from a guardian angel into a figure of profound mystery. The next day, He watched her with a new perspective. He saw the economy of her movements, her naturally elegant posture, the way her presence filled a room even in silence. There was a grace to her, an innate sophistication that contradicted her humble story. Arthur's curiosity, the same analytical instinct that had made him a billionaire by dissecting balance sheets and predicting market trends, focused entirely on unraveling this woman's history. He needed to understand the origin of that gift, of that soul that seemed to be made of the same material as his late wife's. That evening, he approached her again, but this time not in the kitchen, her neutral territory. He invited her to his library, his sanctuary of power. "Isabella, please join me. I'd like to offer you a drink," he said, the formality in his voice barely masking the intensity of his intent. She entered the room, her gaze sweeping over the book-lined walls and the pieces of art, each worth a small fortune. He poured her a small glass of wine and one for himself. "I heard you last night," he said, getting straight to the point. "Singing. That wasn't a lullaby." Isabella looked down into her glass, her face flushing. "I am sorry, sir. I thought everyone was asleep. Sometimes I need to—" "Don't apologize," Arthur said, his voice softer. "It was extraordinary. That is not an amateur's voice. Where did you learn to sing like that?" And then Isabella's story unfolded, not all at once, but in fragments, like a mosaic being slowly reassembled. She told him of her youth in Naples, of how her voice was discovered by the local church choir director. She spoke of the scholarship to the conservatory in Milan, of the years of rigorous training, of the dream of singing at La Scala. She told him of her debut in a minor role, and the modest success that followed. Her career was blossoming. She was a promising soprano, praised for her expressiveness and the purity of her tone. Arthur listened, fascinated, his world of business, of buying and selling assets, seeming more and more two-dimensional compared to the passion and sacrifice she described. "What happened?" he asked. The inevitable question. Isabella sighed, a sound that held the weight of a lifetime of choices. "My mother became ill," she said simply. "My father had already passed, and my siblings were too young. There was no money for caregivers. The choice was between my career and my family, and for an Italian girl, that is no choice at all." She left the stage, the imminent glory, and returned to her village to care for her mother during her final years. When her mother died, her moment had passed. The opera world had moved on. Her voice, once her passport to the world, became a secret, a painful memory of a silenced passion. She came to America for a better life, to send money, meager dollars that were a treasure to her family, and took the only work she could find, cleaning the homes of the wealthy. Arthur was silent for a long time, processing the enormity of her sacrifice. His own life, built on the premise of ambition and the accumulation of wealth, suddenly seemed selfish. He had built an empire, but Isabella had built a family, sustained by the abandonment of her own dream. He looked at her, no longer as a maid, a caregiver, or even a mystery. He saw an equal, an artist, a soul who, like his late wife, understood that music was more than sound. It was the fabric of life itself. "No one should ever have to silence their music," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that surprised him. In that moment, the relationship between them changed irrevocably. It was no longer that of employer and employee. It became that of two wounded souls, finding solace in the discovery that they were not alone in their grief. And the music, which was healing his son, was now beginning to weave a fragile, unexpected melody between the two of them. The revelation about Isabella's past deepened the bond between her and Arthur, but it also intensified Leo's journey. Now, understanding the depth of the talent Isabella had sacrificed, Arthur saw the sessions in the music room not just as an act of healing for his son, but as a rebirth for her as well. He insisted that she sing openly, not just lullabies, but the arias of her past. At first, Isabella hesitated, feeling it would be self-indulgent, but Arthur was adamant. "Leo doesn't just need to hear music," he said. "He needs to feel the joy it brings to the one who creates it. He needs to see what happens when a soul refuses to be silent." And so, the music room transformed into a private conservatory. Isabella sang Puccini and Verdi, and Leo, sitting beside her, absorbed not only the notes but the passion, the pain, and the triumph in her voice. His own playing at the piano became more confident, more expressive. He wasn't just reproducing melodies. He was learning to infuse them with feeling. The most remarkable transformation, however, was happening beyond the keyboard. Leo's voice began to return, not in words, but in sound. One day, while Isabella was singing a particularly high passage from O mio babbino caro, Leo, in a burst of pure joy, opened his mouth and joined her on the final note. It wasn't a word. It was a pure, sustained, "ah," perfectly in tune. They both stopped, breathless, their eyes wide. The sound hung in the room, an audible miracle. Isabella began to cry, tears of pure happiness streaming down her face. Leo looked at her, startled by her reaction, but then he saw the smile through the tears, and for the first time since his mother was gone, he smiled back, a wide, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. From that day on, singing became his first language. They sang together, harmonizing on simple melodies, their voices intertwining. Isabella's a deep river, and Leo's a clear stream running alongside it. Arthur watched this symphony of healing with a heart that was overflowing. His house, once a shrine to grief, was now filled with a music that was more than sound. It was living proof of the resilience of the human spirit. His interest in his business waned. The calls from his brokers about stock market fluctuations or the yield of new crypto investments seemed distant, irrelevant. His greatest investment was right here in this room, and the dividends he received couldn't be measured in dollars or euros. They were paid in smiles and sung notes. He was falling in love, not suddenly and overwhelmingly, but gradually and deeply. He was falling in love with Isabella's strength, her generosity of spirit, the way she had not only rescued his son, but had rescued him from his own emotional exile. The climax of this quiet journey was approaching in the form of a school event, the annual talent show. Leo's teacher, who had watched his progress with astonishment, suggested he participate. "Even if he just plays a short melody," she told Arthur, "it would be a huge step for his social reintegration." Arthur brought the idea to Isabella and Leo. To his surprise, it was Leo who seemed most enthusiastic. He pointed to himself, then to the piano, and nodded with a fierce determination in his eyes. They decided he would play and sing Ilara's Lullaby, the song that had started it all. The days leading up to the show were filled with a sweet tension. Leo practiced with a focus Arthur rarely saw even in his most dedicated executives. Isabella was by his side, not as a teacher, but as a conductor of the soul, tuning not the notes, but his courage. On the night of the show, the school auditorium was packed. Arthur sat in the front row, his palms sweating, his heart pounding. Beside him, Isabella was equally tense, her hands twisting a small handkerchief. Then, Leo's name was called. A small, quiet boy walked onto the stage, approached the grand piano that seemed to swallow him, and sat down. A deep silence fell over the auditorium. Leo looked out at the audience, his eyes searching for and finding Arthur and Isabella. He took a deep breath, placed his fingers on the keys, and the first note sounded, clear and perfect, in the expectant silence. The first notes of the lullaby hung in the auditorium air, delicate and fragile as glass. Each note was a drop of memory, a ripple in the pond of silence that had formed around Leo for so long. Arthur held his breath, his entire body an ear, every fiber of his being tuned to the small miracle unfolding on stage. Leo played with a concentration that transcended his age, his expression serious but serene. He wasn't performing, he was telling a story, his story, through the keys his mother had once played. After the instrumental introduction, the moment everyone was waiting for arrived, he took a deep, audible breath in the quiet auditorium, opened his mouth and sang. His voice was not that of a trained singer. It was small, a little shaky at first, but it was clear, and it was real. "Sleep now, my darling, the moon's in the sky." The words, so simple and so laden with history, floated out over the audience. They weren't just words, they were the embodiment of hope. The victory over a year of imprisoned silence. Arthur felt tears stream freely down his face, but this time they were not tears of pain or frustration, but of release. Beside him, Isabella wept silently, her hands covering her mouth, her shoulders shaking with the force of the emotion. She didn't just see Leo on stage. She saw the culmination of every hummed note, every encouraging touch, every act of faith. The song ended, the last note of the piano echoing and slowly fading away. For an instant, the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence, one filled with awe and reverence. Then, the auditorium erupted. The applause was thunderous, a wave of sound that engulfed the small boy on the stage. Leo, stunned, looked out at the standing, cheering crowd, and a smile of pure relief and joy split his face. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was electric. Leo, still buzzing with adrenaline, ran through the house, touching objects as if seeing them for the first time, his energy filling every corner. He was talking, not in full sentences, but in single words, bursts of observation. "Light," he said, pointing to the chandelier. "Piano," he yelled as he passed the music room. Every word was a celebration. Arthur and Isabella watched him, their hearts too full to speak. Later, when Leo had finally fallen asleep, exhausted and happy, Arthur found Isabella on the terrace, looking out at the moonlit garden. "Thank you," he said, coming to stand beside her. The words seemed inadequate, too small to contain the immensity of his gratitude. "You don't have to thank me, Arthur," she said, using his first name for the first time. "We did it together, you, me, Leo, and Ilara." The mention of his wife's name didn't bring the usual pang of pain. Instead, it brought a sense of peace, of a circle completed. Ilara's music hadn't died. It had only been dormant, waiting for the right hands and the right heart to reawaken it. "Isabella," Arthur said, turning to her, his voice serious, "what I feel, it goes beyond gratitude. What you didn't just bring music back to my son. You brought it back to me, to this house, to my heart." He took her hands that had scrubbed floors and polished silver, but that also held the power to heal souls. "And I have fallen in love with you, Isabella, not with the caregiver or the singer. I've fallen in love with the woman who taught me that the greatest fortune isn't what you accumulate in a bank, but what you build within the walls of a home. Marry me." The proposal was not a surprise. It had been building note by note, melody by melody, for weeks. Isabella looked up at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. Her smile was the answer. She didn't need words. Her whole life had been about what lay beyond words. With a nod, she accepted, and the house, once a monument to success and a shrine to grief, prepared to become, at last, a home. The wedding of Arthur and Isabella was not a grand social event reported in the society columns. It was an intimate ceremony held in the mansion's garden under the arch of the rose bushes Isabella had tended so lovingly. The only guests were a handful of close friends and Isabella's family, flown in from Italy, their sun-weathered faces beaming with pride and wonder at their Bella's fairy tale. The ring-bearer, of course, was Leo, Dressed in a small suit, he walked ahead of Isabella, not carrying a pillow with the rings, but holding a single sheet of music, his mother's lullaby. During the ceremony, he sat at a small electric keyboard set up on the lawn, and as his parents exchanged their vows, he played the melody softly. His music was not background, it was the blessing, the living testament to the love that had brought these two souls together. Life in the Davenport mansion transformed. Silence was banished forever, replaced by a tapestry of happy sounds. Leo's voice, now fluent and curious, asking 1,000 questions a day. The constant music, coming not just from the music room, but from the kitchen, where Isabella sang as she cooked pasta that filled the entire house with its aroma. And most importantly, the sound of laughter. Leo's laugh, which had once seemed impossible, now echoed through the halls. Arthur discovered a capacity for joy in himself that he thought he had lost forever. He drastically cut back his hours at the office, delegating the day-to-day management of his financial empire. He found that the true return on his life wasn't in the growth of his net worth, but in the moments spent playing catch with his son in the garden, or listening to Isabella sing while she read Leo a bedtime story. His fortune, which had once defined him, became just a tool, a means to provide security and opportunity, but not the end itself. Isabella blossomed. With Arthur's encouragement, she began taking voice lessons again, not with the goal of returning to the stage, but for the sheer joy of honing her gift. She and Leo spent hours at the piano, not as mentor and student, but as musical partners, composing little songs, exploring harmonies. The music room, its windows now always open to the sun, became the creative heart of the family. On a spring afternoon, about a year after the wedding, Arthur walked into the room to find Isabella at the piano, helping Leo write a new melody. She was pregnant, her rounded silhouette a promise of new life and new music for their home. Arthur leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene. His son, once lost in a world of silence, was now creating his own music. His wife, who had sacrificed her dream for her family, had found a new stage, more important than any opera house. And he, the man who thought he had everything and discovered he had nothing, had finally found his true wealth. The cure for his son hadn't come from the best doctors or the most expensive therapies. It had come in the form of a humble woman who taught him that even when the voice is gone, the music remains. And love, the most beautiful and powerful melody of all, had the power to fill any silence, transforming a house into a home and a broken